Okay, I want to welcome everybody to this latest video podcast. This is a book review of the book uh, The Entrepreneur Roller Coaster by Darren Hardy. And I want to welcome Lee Brower again to talk about this book. Lee, I know that you found it interesting because of its applicability to families and as well as elements of entrepreneurial thinking.
One of the great things, anytime I think you read a Darren Hardy book, is that you're going to see lots of stories, lots of metaphors, and really how to apply it. So I asked myself the question, which has been a very motivating question for me, and that is, if these are true entrepreneurial leadership principles, then do we leave them at the front door of our home and our family, or do they cross over that threshold, and can they become a part of the important lessons that we have as a family? Mm-hmm. Once I took that approach to it, then my learning expanded as I went through it, because I was able to look at it and say, well, okay, how would that apply as a family? How would that apply as a leader in a family? And I think everybody knows that our emphasis in Empowered Wealth is to strengthen leadership. Family leadership is the emphasis, but since it transcends, it's family and business leadership. And so that's always going to be at the top of our mind, Ron, as you know, is will this ultimately strengthen families? Will this ultimately have an impact that will be a stabilizer, really, in today's world?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into the material. I know that you mentioned that Darren tells a number of stories, and we were talking right before we started recording about a few of those, few of his ideas and a few of his stories, and I think there's several that I think have made an impression on you. Do you want to comment on any one of those, or any of his initial ideas?
Well, sure. Let me bring one into context, and where this story shows up is where he talks about characteristics of a leader, and he identified. He calls them the 4 characteristics of a leader in his book, but the way it's broken down, I saw many more characteristics embedded within each one. And so I took the top ones that I could see that kind of really translated well over into a family. So, for example, he said leaders set a pace. That was the very first one. And what he meant by that was that leaders don't do it themselves. He said, here's a secret. People don't go as fast as they can. They go as fast as the leader that sets the pace. And I have to say, this is a confession. All progress begins by telling the truth. So, okay, here it is. I felt like as I was reading this book that he wrote this book to punish me.
So you went into the gap.
I went into the gap. I started comparing myself to these ideal leaders and saying to myself, wow, okay, I can sure see areas where I have the opportunity to improve. And so out of that, I came with this strong, so I look at setting the pace, and I start asking myself the question, am I really setting the pace for my organization? Then let's cross that front door threshold into my family, and am I really setting the pace there? And so it caused some introspection, I think. And then he gives good examples of what that means. That he says, leaders aren't always as self-disciplined as the very best. They're not always, always as positive-minded or as enthusiastic as they should be. In terms of talking about the people that work for them. Okay, mm-hmm. So we want them to be as positive-minded as we are. We want them to be as enthusiastic as we are, but they're only going to be able to be at a pace that we set for them. So everything is at the pace that we set. So we create the standards. The second thing he said, which I thought was really interesting, was the category of do it first. And in that's where one of the stories that he tells was about Gandhi. And he tells the story of how this lady, this mother, stood in line for hours, like 4, 5, 6 hours, just to have a one chance meeting with Gandhi. And she brought with her young son. And as she finally gets up there, she has this one request of Gandhi, and that is that that he tell her son to stop eating sweets because he was addicted to sweets, and she was worried that it was going to have a horrible negative effect on him. So Gandhi listened to her, and he asked her politely to please come back in 2 weeks and ask him again. Well, you can imagine after sitting in line for 5 hours, she hoped for a better answer than that. But she left, and she came back in 2 weeks, waited in line that same amount of time, and when she got up there, she repeated the question, and he said, "Young man," and he asked the boy to come over to him, and he then told him, "Don't eat sweets." And that was basically the extent of it. And so she asked him, she says, "Well, why couldn't you have told him that 2 weeks ago?" And he says, "The reason I couldn't tell him 2 weeks ago is because I myself had to quit eating sweets." And so the lesson there really is, if you're going to be a leader, don't ask people to do something that you're not willing to do, or you've not done yourself, either way. And so leadership, again, is being able to be, all progress begins by telling the truth, but to be in integrity. Mm-hmm. And I've often felt many times as a leader, I'm telling you to do what I say, don't watch what I do. But unfortunately, what we do speaks louder than what we ever say. And
sure. So I think that's a parent's dilemma, for sure. We're parents, and certainly part of our dilemma. I know that I've heard just recently, there's a fairly well-known blogger, columnist, writer, author, James Altucher, and he talks about how you got to lead yourself first. Mm-hmm. You got to one of your number one leadership responsibilities is to assert yourself and lead yourself, and he claims, and I've found this to be true for myself, is that that's probably the hardest thing to do. It's much easier to proclaim yourself or see yourself as a leader of other people, but to actually take responsibility for your own actions and to be self-motivated to do the right things 24/7 and to drive yourself to be the best you can be at all times. That is a tough challenge. So
it really is. It makes me think, Ron, about John Wooden's quote about success. Success is the peace of mind that comes from the self-satisfaction of knowing that you've done the best you can do to become the best you can become. And then his quote, as I'm sitting here listening to you and thinking about my own self and knowing that I'm not nearly as good as I try and expect other people to be, or that I share or encourage other people to be, but I am better than I used to be. So I think about his quote is, "I'm not what I ought to be, I'm not what I ought to be, not what I want to be, not what I'm going to be, but I am a lot better than what I used to be." So celebrate our progress as we go along and read this. And I was encouraged really by a lot of the lessons that were in there to become better, to mm-hmm. become, to know that I can become a better leader. So that did encourage me.
Sure.
And along those lines, the number 3 thing that he said was, you're always on stage. And this gets down to the point you can never delegate your influence. And every action, every comment, every reaction that you put out there is training your team. And so how you respond to something is training your team. So you have to constantly be thinking, how am I training my team? How am I training my family, my children? They're observing every step that I make. So how am I doing that?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me hit the pause button on that one, Lee, because you were telling me several stories about families that you are currently working with and have worked with in the past that I think are illustrative of how this principle applies in families.
The one family in particular, as you really think about it, this is a family that is a multi-generationally business family. The grandfather of the family that we're working with, so the third generation we're working with, the grandfather came over from Europe, worked in the shadows of the Statue of Liberty, and let's just say he was selling fruit without divulging any more.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say that he was selling fruit in the shadows of the of the Statue of Liberty. And as he continued to build that business, eventually they moved to another state, and the son took over the business, and it became a retail operation, extremely successful, a multi-million-dollar retail store. Well, as that continued to grow, the son then turned it over to his sister so that he could, progressing with technology, they moved to an 800 number type of service so they could provide more fruit to more people, more product to more people, let's say.
Like a 1-800 fruit or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And then move from there to the technology and the internet and continue to grow this company, exponentially. However, the retail business wasn't particularly suited to the management skills of his sister. She was a great marketer, a great designer. So he came in and repositioned her, and that then caused a problem with her and the business, and she felt that was unfair, and she went to the father. And the father then fired his son. Even though the son owned stock in the company, he didn't have voting stock, and so he was out, which cut the income chain that he was using to build up kind of a nest egg, if you will, for his children. Well, the son reacted in a way that was a pattern from previous generations, so badly that even his father did not attend his own mother's funeral because of a dispute that they were having. And so here you have this multi-generational pattern now that's starting to repeat itself.
Yeah, yeah.
And what became so obvious to me was that here he has 3 children with 3 sets of eyes that are watching every second of this. So if you think about it, I drew a little diagram for them, and I've used this diagram now. That was the first time I ever used it there, but I've used it several times to make a point. And I drew a diagram, just stick figures, and I put he and his wife in the middle. I put 3 children down below. Up above, I put his parents and siblings. And I asked him the question, if you had to choose between your children or your parents and siblings, you had to choose, which one would you choose? Now, nobody wants to ever make that decision, and nobody should ever have to make that decision. But you think about it, that's the exact decision that he had made. And that was the decision that his father had made when he chose not to go to his own mother's funeral because of a dispute that they were having. And so they put their own children ahead of this other. Now, I'm not saying they should or shouldn't. I'm just saying that that's what happened. So I asked him, who would you choose? And he says, well, we would choose our children. I said, all right, so now I drew some more stick figures, and I drew them underneath the children. And I said, now looking at it, let's say your children are now grown, they're married, and they have children of their own. And if they had to choose between you or their children, based upon what they've seen, who are they going to choose? And he was like, dead silent. And his wife was sitting there both at the same time, and they're both looking at this going, oh, my goodness. I guess they would choose their children.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's a wonderful opportunity to set the stage so that they never have to have that choice. But if they know that that choice is in their repertoire because they've seen it, they've watched you on stage, if you will, they've seen that happen, then that becomes a choice, and that's what Dad did, and that's what Grandpa did, so I guess that's what we do. You have the opportunity right now to set a different stage so that they never, ever have to make that choice, and you can keep those generations linked together. Mm-hmm. And I'm delighted to say that that's exactly what they did. They were successful. That's a big bridge to cross. But they made every effort to assemble that bridge and put it together. But they had now, at least at the very minimum, they set a standard that their children can embrace.
Sure. What strikes me about that, Lee, is that just setting aside the entrepreneur roller coaster book for a second, is that you often talk about the experience does not have to equal the outcome, and that the response is a critical factor. And then the other thing I would say is that I think of one of our tools, the time map tool, and how we talk about we apply that to the time map about our key events that have formed our values and the stories that we tell ourselves, and how we have the ability or the opportunity to rewrite our stories. And that seems to me to be embedded in the story that you just told about the I'll call them the fruit selling family.
Yeah. Well, our client had already interpreted it one way.
Right.
Change the experience of what happened. I mean, the actual experience is not going to change. The sequence of what happened with his sister, what happened with the father, what happened with him, that's not going to change. The one thing that he has control over is how he responds and learns from that. And by taking control of that, instead of being powerless in that moment and living in reaction to that experience and being a victim, if you will, he was able to take control back of it and actually be a leader. And a leader then that because we're always going to have experiences that are unpleasant, that were unexpected, that were unaccounted for, and we're always going to have to deal with them. And the best thing that he can give his children, the best gift he can give them, and you know what he did at first? I mean, before we started working with him, they actually as a family sent the Christmas presents back to his parents to retaliate with him. That's the way they chose to respond. I'm sitting here thinking, will the day come that his children will send back the presents that they intended for his grandchildren back to them? But I think that this is a wonderful family, a wonderful leader, and it's so easy to follow the patterns that have been set and move into reaction. And here was an opportunity to really step out of that and to reinterpret. You can't change the facts, but you can reinterpret the facts to get the absolute most learning that you can out of it for the benefit of what you've learned since then. And you know what? There can even be future learning from that. As this story is collected, as it's shared and talked about with his children, there may be similar experiences where they can say, remember that experience? That's just like this one. How can we handle this one and learn from this experience based upon what we learned here?
Right. Another element that strikes me, Lee, is that it must have taken a tremendous amount of courage to break that pattern. And I know Darren Hardy talks about it within the context of the entrepreneur roller coaster, about how as an entrepreneur you're going to be facing, I mean, that's where the metaphor comes from the roller coaster, is how it's scary and you're going to be going down this big hill and around this hairy turn and all that stuff. But I think that although it's not as dramatic as a roller coaster ride, or maybe not as dramatic as some experiences that you face as a startup entrepreneur, nevertheless, I think it required a great amount of courage in a much deeper sense, I think. Maybe less dramatic on the surface, but much deeper, breaking a multi-generational pattern in a family, I think takes a tremendous amount of courage.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that he said in there was something along the lines, if you're going to be a change maker, then you need to shake the status quo by the shoulders. And he said, if you're going to do that, to improve things, you have to change things. And if you're going to do that, that change is a critical component of progress. You can't have progress without change. But that's that change that frightens you, because as you shake things up, you may become unpopular. And that's that unpopularity, I think, is something that frightens a lot of people. In fact, it freezes people sometimes. And they spend too much time trying to be like other people, too much time trying to remain within the status quo, because they're frightened of that unpopularity. And that sometimes they're so focused on becoming their best buddies. And even in the workplace, I'm reminding I carry in my book, where I write my notes and stuff down, I carry a definition of empathy, and I'll share it with you because I think it applies to what leadership is. It says, one misconception about empathy: it's not going to children, your employees, your clients, and asking them what they want and giving them exactly what they asked for. People often lack the self-awareness or the vocabulary to express their needs, and they seldom consider options that don't exist in their world yet. And I think a leader has that responsibility to be able to, when you lead, is to provide direction and creativity around being able to give them options that they didn't even know existed in their world. And if you're going to constantly speak their language and try to give them exactly what they want, then where's the growth?
Well, you spend a lot of time in your coaching and your work with clients talking about and really guiding and helping people establish that vision. You call it your bigger vision, and you talk about even your first experience in your coaching program is the horizon.
Right.
And I think that it's if I'll go back to the statistics, if only a small subset of the general population really are entrepreneurs, then that means that a lot of people need this type of leadership in their family and in their workspace, and it calls for, I think, people at all levels of life, whether they see themselves as leaders or not, to kind of rally and understand that they may find it unpleasant, they may find it uncomfortable, they may even find that they're not particularly skilled at it, yet the situations that they find themselves in really demand it. They really is necessity, it's a necessity really to develop this kind of ability to become, if not visionary, at least more so, to have that vision to really understand that, see things in situations and have the situational and people skills to help people take that, even if it's a small step forward, that's going to be helpful to them, beneficial to them, to take them down the path of more of what they need rather than what they explicitly say they want.
Yeah. Aren't you finding, Ron, too, I mean, as I read most of these books, a lot of these books, that there's an element missing. And I almost wish that we could re-edit them for our readers and incorporate the role that gratitude plays in every element of what they're talking about here. If you really want to accelerate the process and develop that mindset shift that we're talking about, that empowered wealth mindset shift, as it relates to leadership, you have to understand the link between gratitude, true gratitude, and the leadership that happens there. And very little is really mentioned within this book about that. And it cries out for more of that. And I think if you really think about leaders, and I think about all the leaders, you said something in what you just said, that even if you're not a leader by title, that the world is crying out, it hungers, it thirsts for more leadership. And we can all be leaders. And if we all want to be leaders, then I think that it begins with, how do we implement gratitude into our lives? How do we develop eventually the skill of habits, being able to recognize and habit, and then the skill of being grateful. And we do that by forced effort and developing systems around it, and then ultimately it becomes a habit. And you and I have seen how it actually becomes, in people that have really embraced it, it really becomes a trait for them that's just automatic. It's part of who they are. And being able to develop that pattern as a first step in leadership, to me, is that anybody can start there. I don't care what title you have. I don't care what economic status you have. I don't care what any other demographic or religious or whatever title or responsibility that you have. If you start at that space, then you are immediately positioning yourself as a leader. And so to me, that's something that I see, that if I could reach in and put into some of these books, it would be more around the role that gratitude can play in this leadership.
Well, that was almost a setup for me, Lee, because my response to that is, that's why we do these podcasts, because I don't think others have the similar perspective. Two, I think that the definition of leadership that you've embedded in your slogan, "Go Big," is something that I have yet to see anybody else really talk about. Maybe a little bit Dr. Robert Emmons at UC Davis talks a little bit about it. But for the most part, people don't talk about it and they don't incorporate it in their thinking and the way they apply it. And so, and then the other thing that really jumps out at me is that, well, that's why we have our Empowered Wealth Connect coursework, is because it's readily available there. And in that course, we define what gratitude is. We talk about not just what's commonly known as gratitude or what people commonly think of as gratitude, which is being appreciative, but we also talk about just mundane elements of gratitude, such as please and thank you, and also kind of that rarer form of gratitude, the empowered gratitude. And that's so much a part of our definition of true wealth, and how contribution plays such a role in creating and sustaining wealth, and how gratitude is embedded in the notion of contribution. Those are things that, it's not to fault Darren Hardy or anybody else, but for most of the writers in this space on leadership, on entrepreneurism, their gratitude is a standalone concept that is it's more in the vein of positive focus. The way people treat positive focus, positive thinking. It's an attitude elevator. It's a way to feel better about your situation, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that per se, but I think where you've taken it with your thinking, and where we've applied it in the training that we offer people, is some practical steps to really embed it, make it an ingrained trait, as you said, in people's lives, and that has the tangible long-term benefits of building a trait that is embodied in the influence that you have as a leader in a family, that gives your family the chance of building the kind of culture that can sustain true wealth over multiple generations.